Welcome to the WyldFlower Learning Podcast, where we talk about everything education with leading experts in mental health fields, educational fields, parents, and kids themselves. We hope you enjoy. In this episode, we talk with Dr. Gina Riley. Dr. Riley has her PhD in Educational Psychology. She's a clinical professor and program leader of the Adolescent Special Education Program at CUNY, Hunter College. Dr. Riley has over 15 years experience working with teens diagnosed with learning disabilities and emotional behavioral disorders. She is also a seasoned academic with years of teaching, research, and supervisory experience within the fields of special education, psychology, school psychology, and mental health counseling. In addition, Dr. Riley has extensive experience in online education and distance learning at the college university level. She is known internationally for her work in the fields of homeschooling, unschooling, and self-directed learning. It was really great to get her on. It was kind of a parent panel. We had a parent leading the discussion, and there's tons of questions about this type of education. So it gave them a chance to hear from an expert who studies in the field. Her own child went through a self-directed learning experience, and she develops curriculum on one side, but also studies self-determination theory and schools that don't have curriculum, and kids have a self-directed environment to learn in, and just the cool things she's seeing from that. So some key takeaways that we noticed in the episode: she talks a lot about gaming and tech, and the fact in those studies that they find they get a lot of coders coming out of self-directed learning environments. She touched on assessment and what are ways you can assess kids if you're not using standardized tests and formal assessments. And the biggest takeaway for me was, the question of what do you want for your child? She definitely was coming from an angle of, there should be choice and kids should be able to choose where they want to go. But at the end of the day, there's going to be these consequences. In a self-directed learning environment, you get an individual who's very intrinsically motivated at the end of the day. And in a coercive environment, it's going to be much more externally motivated. So that was probably my biggest takeaway, and what I'm looking for as a parent and with my own kid. I want them to be intrinsically motivated. So what were your takeaways, Ellen?
Oh my gosh, I fangirled on this one super hard. If you guys haven't checked out Gina Riley's podcast or any of her work, you absolutely should go do that right now and then come back and listen to the rest of this one. She is amazing. So she had two really key phrases for me throughout this conversation. One, she talked about the dignity of risk. And I think if we talked in those kinds of phrases rather than, you might fail, right? Like just reframing the concept of failing into there is dignity when you're willing to take a big risk and step out there and try something different. And I think when kids get that idea that failure isn't some sort of negative thing that you should be afraid of and pull back from, it allows us to be creative and to be outside the box thinkers. So I loved that phrase. And then also she talks about practicing preference, which I also really love, because how many times have we heard parents say, well, you have to stay till the end of the season because if you quit, you'll always be a quitter, right? Like, if you don't follow through with dance, what does that mean about you're a quitter? You're irresponsible, unreliable, all these things, when I think at the end of the day, if we really looked at it, knowing what you like and what you don't like is a valuable thing. And when we change our mind about something, not as a spur of the moment kind of a decision, but because I decided this doesn't work for me, these are the reasons why. I think at that point in time, allowing ourselves, allowing our friends and family, and especially allowing our kids to practice their own preference can be really powerful. And I think she highlights so effectively in her unschooling, homeschooling, in all the work that she's done within those realms, that we really just trust our kids, and it's going to be so good. We don't need to have all the constraints. We don't need to decide the context or the curriculum. We don't need to give them the content. We really just need to see and know them and allow them to explore what's meaningful for them.
Yeah, that was really powerful.
Oh, yeah.
And you just reflect on, even in the space, right? Some of the things we have as policies and those things.
Absolutely.
And on top of that, the journey for the parent, right? Like, so the journey for the kid, but in this unschooling approach she went through, like just how much joy she pulled from it, and her own development as a person was really cool. So again, right, the focus to an extent coming back to myself and how am I a lifelong learner and all those things.
Right, yeah. She has a great example of her learning guitar and how that sparked. I remember that one too, so keep your ears open for that part of the conversation. That one was great.
All right, cool. Here we go.
Riley.
Sorry.
That's okay. And I think what you need to know about me is I spend half my life teaching and directing New York City school teachers in the New York City Department of Education, and the other half researching homeschooling, unschooling, and self-directed learning. So I am always in between these two worlds of very traditional schooling and very non-traditional schooling or unschooling or self-directed learning. So when I talk about unschooling, I talk about homeschooling without a curriculum. So this is learning based on a child's strengths, interests, needs, intrinsic motivations. And when I talk about education and my research, most of my research, yes, is about homeschooling and unschooling, but it's mostly about intrinsic motivation in education and sort of child-led learning. I did unschool my son. So my son is now 26 years old. He is an amazing human being. He is a musician as well as an associate editor at a large publishing company in New York City. His first day of school was his first day of college, which makes his learning experience quite unique. And he never entered a formal classroom until that first day of college. Our story is a really interesting one. I was a single mom. I was super young. People would consider me a teen mom. I grew up with my son. So when I talk about our journey, it really was our journey. I grew up with my son. He came to undergrad with me. He came to some of graduate school, and he saw me write a dissertation, which he remembers. Like some people remember their parents bringing them to Disney World, and my son remembers me coding qualitative data at the kitchen table, and that's his good memory of me. So I don't know, but we'll talk about it. When I think of the journey of self-directed learning that I did, every year my son got to choose what type of experience he wanted. I thought I would unschool for 1 year. Kindergarten's not mandatory in New York State. I thought I was just going to do it for that year. And the reason why I just thought I was going to do it for that year is I was watching him. He was 5 years old. I was working and going to school at the time. But when I was with him, I saw this incredible curiosity. He was obsessed with rocks. He was obsessed with like what he saw around him. His interest in geology led him to an interest in chemistry and math and all this cool stuff. So I didn't really see the point in having him go to kindergarten, because at that point it was, he was just so curious and I didn't want to squash that. And so I said, okay, 1 year. I come from a family of public school educators. It was not taken well, to say the least. So when we talk about the journey, again, like family was doubtful, friends were really doubtful, and we just kept going. So every year was a choice. He could choose to go to school. He could choose to stay home. He could choose to do what he wanted to do, and we would have a discussion about it. And every year he chose unschooling. And there were lots of years where that was hard. It was hard in terms of childcare. It was hard in terms of money. It was just hard. But I always felt like his intrinsic motivation to learn was so strong. I wanted to keep that. And that really became a priority. He did not, again, he went through his first day of school was his first day of college. And so middle school, high school was all unschooled. So I know people have a lot of questions about that and how students learn without formal schooling and how students learn led only by their own intrinsic motivation. So I am happy to answer questions focused on that. So I know you have a list for me, so go for it.
Tiffany, please.
Okay. I guess on that note, Gina, could you talk a little bit about what the days looked like when maybe the motivation was low, or maybe your son was struggling with finding something interesting to learn, and how you guys maybe worked through that?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, right? Because people hear this story and they're like, wow, her kid was intrinsically motivated all the time. And wow, her kid was like in college classes with her all the time. And that's really not what happened. A lot of times my son was watching TV. A lot of times my son will say, like, I watched more of Matlock, which was like a 70s mystery show. I spent years watching Matlock. He'll talk about at that time, Nintendo was a big thing and he spent hours playing Nintendo. But mixed with that, he also had these really cool interests, and these interests really followed him. So it was geology for a long time. It was coin collecting for a really long time. And that's where he got really into history. He got into a phase where he played bowling and sports for a really, really long time. And all I kept thinking was, oh my gosh, all this kid does all day is either practice golf or go to the bowling alley. Like, what is going to happen here? And then when he was 15, he got into guitar, and that ended up being a lifelong love. And his bachelor's was in classical guitar. His master's was in music theory. So again, like, this is not a kid who is intrinsically motivated every hour of the day. Sometimes your intrinsic interests, die down. Some days are filled with TV and video games. And I know that's really hard for parents to swallow. But I also think it's an important part of the process. I think as adults, there are days where we are super productive, and there are days where we might not be that productive. And we sit around and we binge watch TV or Netflix, or watch movies. And you know what? The same happens with kids. So I've never separated that, right? It's not like my kid was intrinsically motivated all the time. There were times of real sort of boredom, laziness. But Ben will say the thing that he learned about unschooling was that boredom and laziness are kind of a normal part of the learning process. That when you're bored, you learn to find something to do, right? You can't be bored for an extended amount of time. No one is bored for 8 hours. By the sixth hour, you found something to do. And it's just really waiting that out, whether it be hours or days or years. Some people call that the deschooling process. Some people call that just a phase. Some people call that adolescence. But along with the levels of high intrinsic motivation, there was also a lot of waiting out of boredom and a waiting out of maybe less than optimal learning activities.
Tiffany, do you mind if I ask something?
Sure. No, absolutely.
She said, okay, the deschooling thing. So Ellen and I have read literature, and parents too, right? And you hear about the detoxing phase. And I'll talk to some people and they'll look at me like we're a strange cult and this is part of the dogma. So could you speak more on that a little bit of what you've seen? Because you've researched schools, Sudbury schools and those things. Could you, like a kid who's been in a school system longer might have to go through a longer kind of detox from what I understand and kind of what I'm seeing in the space too. So anyways, could you please go on that a little bit?
Yeah, so deschooling is a really popular topic these days. Deschooling is just a period of time where a student transitions from more formal schooling to home or unschooling or Sudbury schooling or free schooling. And it's a change in structure, right? You're going from a place of very specific structure, a very specific schedule, of very specific demands, to a place where you have to find your passion and your love and your interest. And that takes time and space. I often compare it to if you work a lot as an adult, you know how like the first 4 days when you go on vacation, you're like anxious because like, it's like, I don't even know what to do because I work all the time. So now I'm supposed to relax. Like, what is this? And then the rest of the vacation is amazing. It's kind of like that, right? The deschooling process is when you're just getting out of this sort of schedule-y pressure and you're going into a process where you can really enjoy what you're learning and what you're doing. So that's deschooling to me. Some kids take a long time to deschool and some kids just take a couple of days or weeks, and it really just depends on the kid. And it's a natural, normal process.
So have the grace with them to find their own process and find their own way out of that into participating in the unschooling process. Or maybe
Yeah,
it's intrinsic motivation.
yeah, it's a lot of grace and patience, right? And it's a lot of sort of, we want our kids to be doing things all of the time. We like productivity. I'm a really productive person. I work a high level job. My son now at 26 is a really productive person. He runs 5 medical journals. He works a high stress job. He's really thankful for that period of unschooling where he had grace to go his own pace. And that's really where it comes in, right? The patience, the grace is all part of the process. And it's really our process as much as it is our kids' process.
Well, and on that note, how did you balance your obviously very structured, high intensity student path and career path with this very relaxed, graceful, slower paced of unschooling with your son at the same time?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's, I'll tell you something, I take it with me in my everyday life. So when I am teaching and directing and doing what I do all day at the university, I often remember the times we were unschooling and how lovely those times really were, how much I got to enjoy the path that my son was taking. I was this observer and it was really cool to watch. Those slow times sometimes allow us those slow moments that are really loving and caring and beautiful and will take us through the hard times. So I try to take my unschooling life with me when I am in a more traditional environment, and that has served me well. It's given me a lot of lessons about pacing and about how people learn and how people get productive.
So do you find that you can allow yourself to have the same sort of patience with the students you've had and the colleagues you've had that, maybe don't take that time and just try and plow through it and find a different path?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? It's a different unschooling, democratic schooling, free schooling. It's all a very different form of learning. And I think it's given me a perspective that is different. So when I go into your New York City, average New York City public middle or high school, and I'm watching what they're doing there, I don't inherently think one is worse than the other, right? I think that everything is on a continuum, and I think that everyone has a choice, and people have different ways that they prefer to learn. And I think school's a great fit, traditional school's a great fit for some kids. And on the other end of the spectrum, homeschooling, unschooling, democratic schooling, self-directed learning, free schooling, is a great way to learn for other kids. So for me, it's all a choice, but the unschooling, self-directed learning lessons that I've learned have certainly given me perspective in terms of what I look at when I walk into a traditional public school classroom in New York City. And it's nice to have those two perspectives, right? Most classrooms are very extrinsic orientated. They're very focused on behavior management. Self-directed learning is more intrinsically oriented, very focused on maybe consistency, but not exactly like management. So it's nice to really have that balance, see the two environments, and really be able to compare and contrast them in a neutral way. Really, the outcome is very similar.
you're speaking at the end of the child's what we call educational journey. They've come to find that. So I guess, is there in your experience somewhere that has managed to bring some unschooling into a formal school setting?
Yeah, so that's always been my goal. My goal has always been to bring intrinsically motivated self-directed learning into middle and high schools. It's why I do what I do every day. And I have to say that a lot of times, yes, it's caught on. I think a lot more schools are focusing on more collaborative learning. A lot more schools are seeing the benefits of intrinsic motivation in their students. So that's a great thing. That's a thing that we've been waiting for a really long time. I will say on the other end, right? Like I never talk about unschooling to my teacher candidates. We'll talk about intrinsic motivation. We'll talk about self-direction. It just doesn't serve them for me to talk about unschooling or democratic schooling because they're in totally different environments. It's like talking about the city to someone who lives in a rural area, or talking about, the country to someone who lives in the city. It's two very different environments. So I try not to mesh the two, but the thing that pulls everything together is this focus on intrinsic motivation and learning, which I think is really the key to a really good education.
And when you see that, do you see that some teachers had clued into that and had already incorporated it into their teaching styles, and some it's a completely new introductory idea?
100% yes. Some people are so excited to learn about it. I think the question I get most about intrinsic motivation is like, it's really hard to facilitate, Gina. And that's the truth, right? You have extrinsic motivation. It's really easy to say to your kid, hey, here's a lollipop or a piece of candy. Can you just be quiet for like 45 minutes or 30 minutes or 5 minutes, right? That's really, really easy. And it's harder to ask them, hey, like I have to do this thing. Could you read a book quietly, or could you be quiet for these 30 or 45 minutes because you want to be quiet for me, right? Like it's a different sort of feel. And I think that's important to think about, right? Everything in traditional school goes very fast. We have lesson plans that we have to get through. We have learning that we have to get through. We have unit plans that span weeks and months that we have to get through. And so in traditional school, there's not a lot of time for thinking or intuitive learning or exploratory learning or metacognition. And when we talk about a self-directed learning environment, those things that all my traditional public school teachers crave, the time to explore, the time to gain metacognitive skills, the time to work on social emotional learning, it's all there in this self-directed learning environment. And that's really a gift. And so I think, definitely the two realms can learn from each other. But I think when you talk about self-directed learning, the gift of self-directed learning is your kids come out knowing how to learn, right? They come out with a really deep sense of knowing who they are, of knowing how to deal with specific situations. They come with a lot of critical thinking skills. And these, again, are super important skills that are lifetime generalizable skills.
I did have a question on that, as you touched on in your book. With developing those skills, let's say being a lifetime learner or a lifelong learner, how much did you feel like you coached that or facilitated that? Or how much did you push for just the child to be reflective on that and to develop that? Or did you try to purposely put a challenge or a project in front of them that would continue on that skill?
Yeah, it's a hard question for me to answer. I am not the parent who is like, here's a really great project, let's do it together. Again, at the time, the situation was I was a single parent who was working and going to school. I really didn't have a ton of time to like facilitate this amazing environment. Did we go to museums 100%? Did we go to libraries? We used our library a ton. Did we play and hike and explore and do all the free things that I could ever find? Absolutely. But I didn't ever feel like anything had to be there for me to say like, hey, here's this great thing right in front of you. Why don't we work on this together? It was a really very informal process. But I will say there's no secret to this, right? If you're a parent who likes introducing your kids to different things, go for it. And if you're a parent who just like works with exposure, go for that. If you're a parent who likes to read in front of their kids, read in front of your kids. Your kids learn to read, right? I did a lot of reading and writing in front of my kid. And I don't think it's like, he's now an editor. And I'm thinking, oh, right, that probably came from somewhere. But it wasn't like I was like, here, come edit this book with me. Or like, here, come look at this essay. I did none of that. Absolutely none of that. So, be you and allow your kids to be themselves too. And also trust what you do as a parent. Trust that what you're doing is right and that there's no right answer to this self-directed learning thing. It's just sort of following your own path for you and your family, whatever that looks like.
And it sounded like really focusing on the connection between, or the bond between your child and yourself with that family bond was one of the most key factors of allowing that freedom and autonomy to develop.
Yeah, I will say that the biggest gift that came from self-directed learning was the fact that my child really knew who he was, and we trusted in our relationship. And as much as you invest in your kid in the younger years, it comes back like threefold, fourfold, 1,000-fold as your child grows older. Looking back, the best thing I ever did, probably ever in my life, would be to unschool my kid, because it did form this relationship, this bond. We're really close. He's 26 years old. He's my absolute best person in my whole world. He's the best human being. And through the teenage years, he was fantastic and dealt with a lot of things and could deal with it because he knew he was unconditionally loved and accepted.
I want to jump back quickly to something you mentioned about how you come from a family of educators, and yet you pioneered this route, and at the same time making many great accomplishments. Our school is a pioneer in this region, and a lot of us, this is new territory, so we're kind of going through that uncertainty and doubt, and just wanted to see how, maybe advice for parents about talking with people and, learning to see that progress. Maybe some of the conversations you had with other people who wanted to slip your kid a math workbook on the side, or
all the time.
Family thing, yeah, that we're all getting. So
yeah, no, that happened all the time. I mean, here's the good thing, and I want to give this perspective, right? In the 90s and early 2000s, you did not have a ton of people choosing this form of learning. And although it's been a slow roll, it's 2022, you have so many more people, probably 10 to 20% of the population, choosing a more self-directed path. And that is a huge leap. Right? We were the first unschoolers in our community. And now my neighbors are like, how'd you do it? Tell us the secrets. How do you know? And so when you think of growth, you're the first type of school in your community. 20 years from now, it will not look like this, right? 20 years from now, you will still be the pioneers, but you will learn a lot and have a lot to share with others. So, I mean, the perspective is amazing. The fact that people are talking openly about homeschooling and unschooling and self-directed learning is incredible, because 25 years ago, we were all hiding. We couldn't say the word unschooling. It wasn't even a word. We would just say we homeschooled. I was constantly afraid that someone was going to take my child away. There was a ton of fear because I was doing something different. But I also had that trust that doing something different was the right path for my child. And I am thankful that I kept trusting myself, especially when all around me, family, friends, really, really highly doubted that this was going to work.
Did they come out and talk openly about that with you, like their concerns, or they'd say, we've got students that are doing X and your son doesn't even know about that, I mean, was that hard for you to kind of check that faith, and then hard to maybe explain that to your son?
I have saved the emails. I've saved the letters. I got emails like, we're really concerned about your son's handwriting from the thank you notes he wrote, right? Like his handwriting was atrocious. Even he will say it, like his handwriting was atrocious throughout life. I mean, it's fine, right? Like, again, this kid had a bachelor's, master's, and a real job. His handwriting did not hold him back at all. It's the same thing with like the math. Like, how are you gonna do the GREs without, having a really solid foundation in trig and algebra? I mean, and he'll tell you, I went to Khan Academy and I learned trig and algebra like at 20 whatever, and then I took the GREs. It's, again, that's really the secret to this form of education, right? We're in it for the long haul. And so we're in it to create human beings that are intrinsically motivated, know themselves, self-directed, really able to know what they love and run with it. And school, traditional school, is in it for the grade level haul, right? So you have to have these skills in first grade, these skills in second grade, these skills in third grade. I think we all know that education is not linear, right? It's not like you progress, right? That's really not how it works. It's definitely this like ebb and flow. We learn and we rest. We learn and we rest. And that's very, very normal. And even in traditional schools, when you see kids struggling, I always want to say, hey, let's pause a bit, right? Because struggle is a really normal part of learning.
Well, I had kind of a question on that with the ebbs and flows. Some obviously kids have different motivations, and some just have flat different drives for things. So their ebbs might be really large compared to their flows. But in what you're saying is that's okay. That's how their person works. That's how their inquisitive mind works, and to just honor that and maybe help them reflect on it. But they'll sort it out as they grow and maybe broaden their horizons a little bit on what's available.
Yeah, I mean, I think, think about us when we learn things. When I talk about kid and teen learning, I always talk about like, okay, think how you learn something, right? I don't know about you, but I'm trying to run and I'm trying to run a 5K and I'm at the couch version of the couch to 5K, right? And I'm going to be there for a long time. And that's totally okay. As long as I do it every day and I practice and I do my best, I know I'll eventually be able to run a 5K. My son will tell people, and a lot of unschoolers tell people this, especially in like Peter Gray and I wrote a couple of studies on unschoolers. One is a larger study of 232 families. One is a study of unschooled young adults. And what we found was a lot of times there was no like middle part of learning. So they were like beginners for a really long time. And then all of a sudden they could do the thing. So like, for example, when my son learned to read, he started with Bob books and he kind of like figured out the phonics of it. And then the next thing you know, he was reading Harry Potter chapter books. And there was no middle. And it's so funny because when he reflects on that learning process now, he will constantly say, I do not have an intermediate zone. Like I'm a beginner and I'm an advanced beginner, and then I know how to do it. And again, it's just part of the learning process, and you sort of have to eke out what that looks like for your own kid. That being said, I'm also an adolescent special educator, right? So I know that there are students who have neurodiversity or disabilities, and I will never be the person to say that's not real. There are students who are neurodiverse. There are students who have dyslexia or dysgraphia or dyscalculia or ADHD. But those are a small percentage of students, and we can also work with them within a self-directed learning environment as well.
And to help those students, that was actually one of our questions, how we identify, if there is dyslexia or something that actually needs some assistance. Do you kind of have you seen it gone about in a similar way, like a specific coach or specific help from someone who can help them work through that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the parent and family and how they want to work with the specific need. And so I did a study on unschoolers and reading. So people who didn't learn how to formally read. And while traditional school circles will tell you that the age in which people have to formally read is about 6 or 7, we learned that unschoolers have a range. Some learned at 4, some learned at 7, some learned at 11. And in a traditional school system, that 11-year-old would be labeled or categorized as dyslexic. And I'm not saying they wouldn't be in a self-directed learning environment as well, but I am a very, very big fan of parents like knowing their gut. And if you feel like your kid needs extra coaching or like multisensory reading method tutoring, then that's available, right? There are a lot of very gentle, very self-directed phonological decoding like programs for individuals with dyslexia. So you should follow your gut with that, but you also need to know that not all development happens at a specific age. So it's not like reading always happens at 5 or 7.
Right. And I appreciate that you do have a foot in both worlds and can see the values of both. And that you mentioned in your book that some kids, a structured environment is really what they benefit from. So the question is, have you run across kids in the homeschooling or unschooling arena that somewhere along the path, somebody realized this really wasn't the best path for them? And how did that work? Maybe you could kind of share with us what that looked like, and then how they did to move to a different path.
Sure. So we always think about it, something we think about as researchers all the time. We always think about like, gosh, maybe this doesn't work for a lot of people. And when I go into any study, I'm going as a neutral person, right? I have a foot in a traditional education world. I know that there's also this self-directed learning / unschooling. So when Peter Gray and I did our study of 75 unschooled adults, I think both of us were waiting. We were waiting for like that drop, right? Those lots of people that said this was not the thing. This was, this shouldn't have happened. And what we found out of those 75 is that there were 3 individuals who felt that their experience, that they would have preferred a more traditional experience and deeply preferred a more traditional experience. There were similarities between the 3. The 3 had 1 or more parents who had some sort of mental illness and or had 1 or more parents who were very, very religious and did the homeschooling or unschooling for religious reasons. Interestingly, 2 out of the 3 had higher degrees. So if you see that as like an indicator of higher learning, 2 out of the 3 had higher degrees. 1 out of the 3 felt they could never get there because of their experience. So, 3 out of 75 is a really small percentage, but there are people where unschooling or homeschooling or self-directed learning is just not for them. And I think it's really important that we honor that, right? Like Tara Westover, whenever I read Educated, I always think about like how she had this very unschooled type experience. And that was clearly not the experience that she felt was healthy for her. She went on to get a PhD and she was highly educated. It was clear that she had competence in academic realms, but she felt it wasn't the type of education for her. So this is the part where we say, like, listen to your kids. That being said, when you look at that rate compared to school failure or school dropout rates, right? You have people that don't do well in traditional school either, and it's a much larger amount. So the comparisons are interesting, but parents and kids should do what's right for their family and their path. And there shouldn't be any pressure here. If this feels like the right thing for your family or your path, then go ahead, run with it, because it really works. And if it doesn't feel like the right thing, then find the right thing.
That's wonderful, because it is, as we're kind of going through this too, I've heard mentioned that parents are like, well, if he hasn't found a passion or if she isn't in reading by 12, then obviously it's not working, when really that might not be the case. If they're a happy kid, they're going through things, maybe they haven't found exactly something to latch onto, but they're still engaged, they're still participating. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think
easier to focus on, oh, well, that's an F in that class, or oh, that, you know, they haven't met their peer levels yet. And that's easy for, I think, our way of thinking and our programmed little boxes to check that off.
Tiffany, do you mind? I got a text from a parent touching on what she just talked about and you did. So Gina, what did you do? Did you give advice to your son when they were getting pressure, right? Like, you're not reading at first grade level and you're, you know, third grade or whatever it might be. And then if you don't test, how do you know where you're at? Or, you know, just any sort of pressure. Did you give advice to your son on how to speak to that? Or did you just try to be that buffer?
I don't think I wasn't a protective parent, right? Like, he heard criticisms from the outside. And the criticism did, I mean, and again, this was earlier. So this is 20 years earlier when a lot of people were criticizing, and the criticisms were not fun. And I could not protect him from all of them. And they still, to this day, they motivate him, right? He had to get his bachelor's degree and he had to be third in his college class because he had to show all those people that doubted him that he could do it, right? So sometimes the pressure motivates you, and other times the pressure can be really, really hard. And I think the one thing that was our motto was that people learn at all different rates and they learn at all different stages. And that goes for social emotional learning, academic learning, right? People are at different places and we need to honor people where they are. That goes for kids and that goes for adults. And so if I gave him one piece of advice, it was that, and we still talk about that to this day. You honor people where they are. And that goes into like conversations about equity and inclusion and acceptance. In terms of the second part of the question, you know, how do you know if your kid is succeeding? You know if your kid is succeeding if they are happy. That's my number one indicator for the growing up was if they are happy, right? If they feel joy from what they are doing. You know, if you want to give a test to see where your kid is and that feels good to you, then go ahead and give a test. I'm not against testing and assessment. But also learning happens in a loop, right? And natural learning happens in a loop too. So you start a thing, you do a thing, you get better, maybe make a mistake along the way, maybe have to repair something along the way, and then you end up with an end result. And that end result is the assessment. And you could talk about this in terms of academic subjects, right? So if you start a book and you finish it, that's the assessment. You finished it successfully. You could talk about it in terms of running. If you start a race and you finished it or you did better than you did before, that's success, right? I think the conversation about assessments and success is very personal. I think it's very personal in adulthood as it is in kid and teenhood. So you kind of have to figure out what's the indicator. For me, the indicator was never test scores. Test scores rarely mean anything to me than the kid studied for the test. What I really look for, and this is what I look for in my graduate students as well, is indicators of generalizable learning, where they can take what they learned and put it in another place or bring it to the real world, and or reflective learning, where they can do something, either succeed or fail, and reflect on it. That's what I really think is important. Traditional education is moving toward that realm too. Higher education, we're talking a lot about ungrading, which I think is really interesting. And so if you're interested in higher ed and you're interested in the conversation about assessment, Susan Bloom's Ungrading is a really interesting book to read. Again, it's very higher ed focused, very assessment focused, but it's really looking at tests and rubrics and grades very differently. It's not the be all end all, it's just an indicator.
I have so many questions. I'm trying to figure out which way to go.
Yeah, we're having so much fun, so go for it.
Well, maybe we'll stick on that track for a second. And part of us wondered, like, if this is so healthy for a lot of kids, especially when we talk a lot about within our space, the emotional intelligence and the social intelligence. do you feel this movement or this model, however you put it, could be scaled up and done at even half of the US and half not, and stay in traditional? And I guess the second part to that be, where do you see the future of self-directed learning?
Yeah, I mean, we have grown tremendously, and especially post-pandemic. The number of homeschoolers has doubled. I don't know where that will go in 2 years, but I will tell you that we have grown tremendously in 20 years. I have that perspective. I'm so glad I have that perspective, right? Of seeing no one do it to seeing like my neighbors ask me about it, which I always think is like the coolest thing ever. Oh my gosh, like no one ever asked me about this, and now you're asking me. It's so cool. I think the future of education is intrinsically motivated education. I think every college of education knows that. I think we're all talking about what the future of education looks like. I think traditional education will go through a period of great transformation. And I will tell you that I think it will involve self-directed learning. I think that a lot of schools are seeing the benefit of students working on their interests and strengths and doing what they love. And I think a ton of schools are seeing the benefit of social emotional learning, which everyone's just trying to like grasp onto. That being said, any sort of alternative form of education is going to be an alternative form of education, because as we saw with traditional schools after the pandemic, a lot of people need schools as forms of childcare. A lot of people do not have flexible jobs or entrepreneurial jobs where they can, either join a co-op or do some sort of homeschooling or unschooling. And this is why I love self-directed learning centers and schools that allow parents to have a place to have their children be self-directed learners in an environment that's healthy and full of facilitators and people that really care for them. So how grateful you all should be to this school, because it really is a place where people are safe and free to grow in the way that they want to. So that's really lucky. I can't see everyone in the world doing self-directed learning, because that's just not how our world works. Our world is very still traditional. There are many political forces that also depend on public schooling. Public schooling is a huge, not only educational issue, but also a political issue. And so, it'll never be 50%, 50%, but we certainly are seeing the 2080 happen. And as Peter Gray always talks about the tipping point, we're there, we're at that tipping point, and we'll see how this spills over.
Well, that's actually another perfect segue into my next question, so I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, good.
From reading your books and your studies and talking with you now, that connection between the child and the parent, or the child and the family, is so strong. And in our situation, we have wonderful facilitators, teachers, guides, whatever you'd like to call them, who are with our kids during that time. So I was hoping you might have some advice for parents in our situation of how we can connect, how we can participate in this without being the ones to kind of coach and facilitate.
Yeah, I've leaned on the word parent, but I think in this case, we're really talking about what I talk about all the time when I talk about how to facilitate intrinsic motivation and learning, and that's kids having a sense of relatedness, right? And a sense of relatedness can be with the parent or guardian, but a sense of relatedness can also be with a facilitator or guide. And what relatedness is, it's just that notion that kids have a person that unconditionally accept and love them no matter what. Whether they make mistakes, whether they don't, right? Whether they feel failure, when they feel success. It's really, really important that kids have those adults in their lives. And so when we're talking about the relationship between parent and school and parent and facilitator, right, you're all at the same end goal, to take really great care of these amazing human beings. And so working together in that is the best thing you can do together, right? Seeing the potentiality and seeing the amazingness of the human beings, little or big, in front of you. And that y'all do together. That's the easy part. The hard part is like when they make mistakes and when they fail. But yeah, right, like that's the hard part.
Yeah, which maybe in our situation might be easier because we only get part of the mistakes and part of the
Yeah.
Honestly, even just today, we had one little one who we run a jury. So they have a whole judicial committee like Sudbury does. And so there was a ticket written on somebody. And so we just had a chat and talked through consequences that made sense. And do you understand why this got written? And they're like, yeah. And one of them was just really having a hard time letting it go because it felt like a failure, felt like a mistake, and it was getting bigger and she couldn't let loose of it. So we sat down and I was like, okay, tell me what's going on, because I can feel her, stewing in it. And so we pretended that we had a dandelion. And I was like, take a deep breath in. And it's just this one moment. It's going to teach us something. Let's blow on the seeds and see where they go. What can we take? So we pretended to blow the seeds away. And we just talked about, this isn't a mistake like something bad happened. This is a chance where we say, well, maybe in the future, I just don't do it the same way that I did this one time. But did I learn some things in the process? Yeah, I did. I learned, and it had to do with paint and color mixing and using too much of something and being a good community member. So we just I think if you take the negative judgment from those moments, and they're just chances to learn. What is our opportunity to learn here? And we don't have to then heap this judgment, condemnation on ourselves or on our kids or on our community members. We can just say, this is one more chance that we got to learn. What do we learn? Okay, now release that and let's keep going, So if we can just love through those hard moments and just find the lesson, I think it releases everybody from that tension.
I love that you said that. We're going through a really hard, interestingly, right? I spend my life in research talking about no curriculum, and I am leading a curriculum re-registration process for New York State. so the irony, right? But we had a conflict at work about this, and I'm thinking the dandelion would have been the perfect, just right, breathe. And it's not permanent, and it's okay. And we'll sit in our feelings for a second, and then we'll release them. And what a beautiful generalizable skill that is. I also want to talk a little bit about dignity of risk, and when kids make their own decisions, right? Part of making your own decision is the dignity of risk, that you're going to make great decisions and you're going to make not so great decisions, and we're going to support you in all of it. And that there's dignity in having done the thing and made a mistake or taken the risk because we tried it, and now we know better. So dignity of risk is also a really important part of this process.
Has your son reflected on anything like that, kind of once he got into the college realm or the work realm? Because not everybody in those arenas are very generous with mistakes or things that needed correcting. Did he run into that?
Yeah, 100%. Freshman year was not hard, but he self-corrected a lot in freshman year. So he had to get used to, right, getting up for his 8 o'clock in the morning class. P.S. He was not the only, it wasn't like the unschooler just had to get used to getting up for the 8 o'clock in the morning class, right? It was all the other traditional schoolers as well. But he felt that was a big thing, right? So he self-corrected, and that was a learning. The other thing was the handwriting, learning how to take notes and just for the test, which I thought was an interesting sort of thing. He would always read and take notes and focus on the things he was interested in. And then all of a sudden he was entering this college environment where he was going to get tested at the end. So he really had to learn to read and take notes for the test. And that was a huge self-corrective, reflective moment, learning moment for him. And that was a biggie for him, a real biggie. So I think that the test taking, as well as the, the getting up and going to class on time kind of thing, was a real biggie. But I have to say, again, these things that you notice, these mistakes that you make in college, they're not isolated to unschoolers or self-directed learners, right? When you arrive at your freshman year of college, I was traditionally educated. My freshman year of college was a mess, right? I dropped out of college the first year. I didn't know what the heck I was doing. Okay. And so, you learn from those things, and unschooling doesn't shield you. It widens your world. Same thing with self-directed learning. And I always say this, when you put your child into a self-directed learning center, it doesn't shield them from anything. It widens their world. They're active. They know how to deal with adults, act like, mature. There's so many benefits, and it definitely enhances the experience of childhood.
Gina, it might have been, I'm sure it was on your podcast, but others, I think that some of the biggest complaints from unschoolers or, graduates of democratic schools, one of them was the pressure, right? Feeling like an outcast in a sense of it is different than what most of the community is doing. But the other part was adjusting to how immature all of their peers were in college.
It was the crazy, like we heard this story 100 times over from unschoolers, right? That it was sort of like, it wasn't me that had to do the adjusting, right? It was sort of like dealing with individuals who didn't act like adults. And they were like, I've been acting like an adult since I was 15. I kind of knew the adult game. But I have to deal with all these people that like really don't act like adults. So yeah, that was an interesting finding, I will tell you.
It's good to hear, yeah, especially the common denominator of a freshman year.
Yeah. It's the same for everyone.
Did your son also, did he have some social groups growing up that were much different than entering into that college and adulthood realm? Was that difficult for him to navigate?
It's so interesting. He was an introvert from when he was very small. So he would have one or two friends, and everyone worried about that. Like my husband, I was a single mom. I got married at 11. My husband was very anti-homeschooling, very anti pretty much everything we were doing. I'm still married. And now he's the biggest proponent, right? He will tell everyone and anyone about it. But he really knew that he was more of an introvert, and that he only, would really prefer one or two friends. And that kind of went for a while. He liked individual sports like golf and bowling. He liked to compete against himself. He wasn't really into like the whole competing against other teams and things like that. He was really self-conscious about that, especially as a homeschooler, unschooler, self-directed learner, right? When your kid's an introvert and they're doing this thing that's different to everyone, the thing that's different to everyone tends to get blamed. And then when he was a teenager, he read Susan Cain's Quiet. And he will say that Susan Cain's Quiet changed his life. He could identify himself safely as an introvert, as someone who prefers the company of a few friends rather than a whole group of people. When he got into college, he hung out with a whole group of people. And so he knew his introverted self like needed some quiet space to recover from that, but he did it. And now he has a strong group of college friends, and he has a strong group of workplace friends. And he knows, it's so interesting, like seeing this adult now in the professional arena really succeeding, knowing the skills. And he says, it wasn't that much different from when I was 15 or when I was 16. The people around you are your colleagues, and some will become your friends. And you do have to know the boundary between colleague and friend and what that means. And that's all navigated too. Susan Cain's Quiet, though, if you have an introvert kid, read Susan Cain's Quiet, because it's very, very eye-opening. She has a new book out called Bittersweet, but that's a whole different realm.
Okay.
We were just talking about ambiverts.
Something that we wanted to ask you, and part of it is kind of a trend word now, but do you, from your research, do you see that that intrinsic motivation is within children? Is that grit or ability to persevere also something you see is in there and that just grows, or is that actually something that you feel has to be developed?
That's such an interesting question. You gave me this question before, and I have mulled on it for 3 days now. I love positive psychology. I love Martin Seligman's work. I love Angela Duckworth and grit. I love resilience. Kids are really resilient beings. I am not, an expert on resilience, so I couldn't tell you whether it's intrinsic to them or whether it's learned. But I will know, and anyone who's a parent will know, that kids can go through a lot and get on the other side. And I wish I had those skills as an adult. I feel like we lose them almost as an adult, but kids are really resilient. You know, life is hard, right? Life is not this easy, happy rainbow that we want it to be. Life is hard. And whether you are traditionally schooled or unschooled or self-directed learners, everyone goes through periods of hard and everyone goes through periods of amazingness, and the hard just makes you stronger. So this is less about schooling and more just about how we can enhance in our kids a sense of, we can do this, we can do hard things, we can find joy in the beauty too. Life's not always going to be easy, but that's okay, because sometimes it's easy and we're going to have fun when it's easy. So I really think that, I don't know whether it's internal, although I asked my son, do you think resilience and grit is like internal? And he's like, yeah, I think kids can bounce back, right? And he bounced back from a lot. He had a terminally ill, like when I married my husband got cancer. He dealt with all of what cancer brought, and he was home, right? Sometimes when you put your kid in school, it shields them a little, but he was home with that. And we all got through it, right? And that's just life. So I think just teach your kids that, we go through the hard, we can do hard things, and we go through the easy and we find joy, and we're just going to give gratitude for every day.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I like that a lot. I wonder too, like you said, like everybody wants to know, okay, how'd you do it? Just give me the recipe. This will be so easy. No problem. But I was hoping you could maybe touch on some points where, did your son have these ebbs that we discussed, and then you kind of were tempted to like, here, try this, or let's go here. And I mean, was that a need to feel like you needed to present some of those exploration opportunities you mentioned, or was it easier to sit back and let him kind of be bored and then find that next step?
I don't know if he had the choice, right? I gotta say, like I said, right? I will never, ever give parenting advice. I am not the perfect parent. If you are perfect, raise your hand. I need to learn from you. None of us are, right? We're just doing the thing, and we're doing the thing together. I was, again, a young single mom without a lot of money, working, going to school, and homeschooling. So a lot of like the unschooling happened in the car, or again, watching Matlock, definitely reading tons of books, tons and tons of books. I mean, you see it, right? Like this is what our house looks like just generally. So there was always books in the house. He saw people read the newspaper all the time. He heard people talk about feelings. So he had like this great like vocabulary of feeling words, because we're all just very dramatic and talk about feeling all the time, and how are you feeling and what, and I think in the end he just knew he was very, very loved. And I am very thankful and grateful that that was enough. Again, that was enough for him, right? I am not the parenting expert, but I will tell you, like, my barriers are you need health. Your kid needs to be healthy. Your kid needs to feel safe. Your kid needs to feel loved. And my son would add, give them a lot of books, a lot of musical instruments, take them to libraries, allow them to play and explore, and they'll be just fine. So that's kind of my parenting philosophy. It's like a plant. You water it, right? Sometimes you forget, but you like water it again and make it better. But it's all the same, right? We're growing humans and we just want to grow good humans. And imagine if the world was full of good humans who got to do what they loved for most of the time in their childhood and teen years. This would be a very different world.
It would indeed. And I think for a lot of adults I've spoken with, it's hard for them to imagine that in their daily lives. You know, maybe they have a 9 to 5, or maybe they're doing something for an obligation, and it's really hard to, imagine what that life would be like if you had that freedom and then can continue it into adulthood.
I mean, it's really hard for me, right? I struggle with it all the time. I work on a very strict schedule. I'm kind of a workaholic. I love what I do. I can work and work and work and not stop. And I sometimes have to remind myself, go outside, look at the forsythias, look at the daffodils. It's beautiful. Do you remember when you had this time with your child? So it's a reminder and it's a learning.
Can we, Tiffany had a question earlier about the parent role, right? You were an unschooler at home. So you had the gift of seeing your kid grow. But for our parents, right, they're sending them to us.
And they won't give us a double mirror so that we can hang out.
We can talk about that.
Yeah.
But a cool story you had, like your son getting into guitar. Could you quickly share that story?
Sure. So my son, that's a funny story. So I got a guitar from a student. I like wanted to play guitar. It seemed cool. A student gave it to me as a gift. And I was like, I can't take this. He's like, no, I have like 50 of them here. Just take it. You always wanted to play this. So I was like, okay, but I'll give it to you back, right? Like I'll just borrow it. I'll give it to you back. So I went to take guitar lessons. And I asked my son, like, hey, do you want to take guitar lessons? And he was like, no, I don't want to learn this, right? So I started to take guitar lessons and I started to play and I really enjoyed it. And it was fun and it was hard and it was challenging. So my son noticed me practicing and he's like, well, how do you do that? Can you teach me how to do that? And I'm like, I can't teach you because I don't know what the heck I'm doing. Right? Like, so you don't want to learn from me because I really don't know what I'm doing. But I said, but I could probably, like, you could take a month of lessons with my guitar teacher and and he's like, nah, I'm really not interested in that. And I just kept playing and practicing. And I didn't even think like he was going to bring it up, but he's like, okay, maybe I'll take like a month. That's it. And I was like, yeah, no problem. So he borrowed my guitar. He took a month of guitar lessons. He really didn't like it at first. And then his guitar teacher taught him how to improvise and it just, right. And to that point on, like he was obsessed with the guitar, like obsessed. And so, yeah, that guitar teacher became his guitar teacher and not mine anymore. Couldn't waste my money on lessons for me anymore. It was all him. And he later became a classical guitar major. He was a classical guitar major all throughout college. He's a beautiful musician, really gorgeous musician. And was a music theory master's and then went into editing because it was a real job and he craved a real job. And so his path has been really cool and interesting, but that's the guitar story again. Like lessons weren't forced. It was just sort of like he saw me play and he's like, how do you do that? And I'm like, I can't teach you. So let's bring in someone who can.
And that's very different, it seems, from I think oftentimes we see parents who are expose your kid to everything so that they know whether they like it or not, right? So I think there's problematic tendencies there. So it's just different than kind of what you're describing with your son.
Yeah. I mean, go ahead, Gina.
I just think the secret is doing what you feel joy in, and then your kids see you joyful, and then they want to do a thing that makes them joyful too.
So that's the reason I wanted to share that story is I think it's a beautiful example of that connection point, right? We talk about lifelong learning and how can parents model that. Dr. Tran is sitting right here. I don't know if you can see him. He did 4-session workshop and a huge emphasis. It was unconscious parenting, and really it's about modeling, right? So Alison Gopnik's research on how much kids absorb just by seeing the adults around them. It's a lot more than, you know, the things that we're actually telling them to do.
Yeah.
So as a parent who doesn't get to hang out with their kid in a space, Ellen and I are lucky for the most part, because we get to see our kids in the space. And so you get to have that experience you had. But if you are disadvantaged and are on the outside, my thinking was kind of, right, like that's a great connection point of doing something you really enjoy. They see it. And then you get to bond and they might pick up whatever you're doing. And I think a big piece is like not going in with the intention of, okay, I want my son to be good at music, so now I'm going to sit out here with a guitar. I mean, I guess some of that might be in play, but it's more about being authentic right in front of them. And I think
we lived in a very small space. There was no choice, right? You watched me do everything.
Yeah.
No privilege of privacy.
Yeah, no.
Yeah. And I think to Mary's point, you see a lot of, and I think it's right, it's good opportunities for kids to go do things like join a soccer team or hockey or those things. But those extracurricular activities are disconnected from the parent. So I wonder if some advice is make sure you find that time where your kid can see you learning, right? Like if you're overscheduled and you don't have chances to connect, I don't know, I'm going all sorts of places a little bit, but yeah, what advice would you give to parents who don't get to have that relationship in a sense like you had, but still, right, there's tons of time to.
Yeah, I think the modeling thing is part of it. And it's not even like conscious modeling, right? The time you spend with your child should be done doing things you love, right? Do things for you. Because I think a lot of times, sometimes you can get resentful when you're doing everything in your free time for other people, right? Do things for you. Have your children see that, witness that, be with you while you're doing that thing. Because that's how they see, like, kids want to see their parents happy, right? Kids want to see mom doing something that she loves. And it's cool to witness. It's really fun to witness your parent doing something that they love, right? It's even in adulthood, it's really cool to see like your parent in their zone. And so just seeing that, just seeing your parent achieve goals or your parent do things, even in their workplace that's really valuable to them, that's exciting to see. Again, like my son's memory is not Disney World, it's me coding. Qualitative research when I was working with Dr. Gray. That's my son's like, and then the other day he was like working on Excel spreadsheet. He's like, I thought of you. And I'm like, oh, like, very cool. And I felt a little bit of guilt, but also a lot of joy, right? Because that was my thing. He knew it made me joyful. And he felt that too when he was doing it. So, I mean, you can expose your kids to a lot and you can put things in their place, and really what they want to see is you happy and they want to be happy, and let's model happiness and joy.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, so much. Yeah, something that keeps coming around to is just to really, try and honor what your kids are doing and connect with them about that. Were there points where, man, that's difficult? They were into something maybe you weren't into or didn't see much benefit of, or maybe even went against some of your values.
Those years of bowling were hard. I spent more time in bowling alleys than I would have ever liked to have spent. He really loved it, right? He really loved it. And funnily enough, it was a way, like my dad then got into it, and then my dad's neighbor got into it. So he would bowl with these like two old men, right? And they would like be really competitive. So yeah, I mean, there were times when you were like, oh my gosh, what am I doing, right? Like this might be a really big mistake if like the only achievement my kid ever does is score a 300 in bowling. Right? But it was, it's so funny because like those times are times when he's like, gosh, that was such fun. That was just joy, right? It was so fun. And I got really good. And funnily enough, like bowling and golf now, people go out bowling and golfing to like network and socialize. And that's been a boon, right? Like, especially if you're good at it, like you don't have to look like, like you're horrible at this game in front of colleagues. But yeah, I mean, sure. There were, like I said, not exaggerating. My son and I often talk about the phrase learning loss because it's come up a lot post-pandemic. And everyone always asks me like what I think about learning loss. And the thing that's going to get me canceled forever is I don't believe in learning loss. We are learning all the time, even when we don't know we're learning. And so, yeah, there were years where I completely doubted what we were doing, and I'm glad I stuck with it.
Yeah. Well, that's good. It wasn't for 10 minutes, or something. Like it kept something there that you kept having to reflect against. Or I imagine me trying to sit in a bowling alley with a smile on my face. And
Yeah, it was like it's definitely not my thing, definitely not my scene. But it was sure interesting.
yeah.
I have a question.
Okay, go for it. I got one after you.
One thing we haven't touched on, Gina, is technology. And I know you touched a little bit on TV, but I know that's been kind of a sticky spot. And even our kids in the space have wrestled with what's an adequate amount of time for you to really get focused and busy. Like they get so deep into the thing. So we're talking like Minecraft is a hot one. Roblox is so really social. Like you've got multiple kids in on this activity together. So it's really great. I mean, it really is even social emotional if I go there with the screen involved, but they're creative and they're critical thinking. But I know that the technology, even in our spaces, like how much is too much? And is there too much? And are there different kinds? And what's an appropriate, relationship with this? And Paul and I even have gone back and forth as we've come out of a public school setting. We were both traditionally educated and just thinking there must be something else and wrestling through all of those things together and independently to get us to this place. But technology seems to be this like sticky spot for us still. So can you give us any information that you have had, like what's come up in your research or what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, I will never give a time limit. I will say that responsible use of technology to me is more of a concern, that kids use technology well and productively. And that doesn't mean like not games, right? I think Minecraft is really productive. I think Roblox is really productive. Peter Gray has a ton of research on the benefits of learning from video games, and I know he feels very strongly about it. I don't have strong feelings as long as technology is used responsibly. I think that's my indicator, right? Once it's not used responsibly, then I have a lot of issues. But when it is used responsibly, I don't. We also know from research that a lot of our kids that played video games for like hours and hours on end later became really into coding, later became really into video simulations, those PHET, the PhET simulations, and creating those. You have a lot of homeschoolers who are in the tech field right now. So, again, I think it's personal preference. I would never give advice about technology, but I will say that responsible use as well as academic use is important. I sit in front of a computer all day long.
Right?
That's right.
All day. That's my job.
It's hard to know, but good response.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, that's a hard, right? That's a very personal sort of conversation that you have to navigate with your kids and with your students. Yeah, that's one of those very personal conversations. I will say, my son will say, I'm not giving my children a phone till they're 16. He didn't have a phone till he drove. So that was again, because we were poor. We didn't have resources, but that came in very handy.
Well, I'm glad he agrees with your parenting now.
There you go.
Right. That's interesting though, that he kind of doesn't feel like every kid should have one at the age of 4, like they do, yeah, it's interesting that he spent a lot of time, like you said, on Nintendo and Matlock. I don't know why he
Yeah,
I get to see this.
I go on my, like, he'll call me out, right? Like, do you have to have your phone out now, right? I'll be the one watching TikTok.
Yeah.
So he really learned to self-regulate, and that might be just through his, okay, I'm gonna overindulge,
Yeah, while he spent hours getting really good at like Wii golf, the Nintendo Wii golf and bowling, I mean forever. And that little Nintendo Switch thing forever. Right. And so yeah.
I wonder, because addiction, right? Like it's so new and the research coming out, and I have my own opinion on it and such. But I think Peter Gray's argument is fairly solid in the sense of kids are going to play with the most important tools in culture. And I mean, we're on it right now. So they see us on it all the time. So it's how do you, right? Like, how do you help facilitate that? I know Naomi Fisher is in the same kind of boat as far as like, don't focus on the time, right? Because then that actually steals an opportunity to help facilitate the regulation, right? If you have these more rigid guidelines on it, you can't even go there with them. And it might set up a different relationship where actually they don't trust you in the sense of, I'm going to come to you with these things because I know of a fear that a parent might, as a parent you might have. And then you've perhaps dissolved the chance to actually like learn through this together, right? Because us adults need help with, right? Which apps you can do to regulate your time use and those things. I mean, right? Like, I know for myself, it's good to be aware of those things. So,
yeah. And even like schedule, the modeling thing is big here, right? So if you're not on your phone all the time, probably your kids are not going to be on their phone all the time too. Phone is also a really good distraction when you're tired, bored, feeling sad, feeling angry kind of thing, and might be a really good self-regulation strategy for some kids when they're feeling frustrated. But yeah, it's definitely a conversation and none that I have answers for.
right. Yeah.
It can kind of be more of the modern day type of connecting piece too. Like I'll notice Fern will come up to me and be like, "Mom, look at my character. Look what I did to my character." And so it's an opportunity for her to come and show me and invite me into that world. And boy, oh boy, has she gotten frustrated with me on like VR and like just trying to show me things. But she plays the teaching role in those moments, and she's 7. So it's really kind of cool how it provides that opportunity for her to show me, and teach me. So
yeah. And then there's those days where you're like, all right, we're destroying everything in the house. That's electronics. Right? Like, let's hide or something.
Yeah. It's sunny outside.
Yeah.
Oh, their own thing now.
But that's our own box, right?
Yeah, I wonder.
If they've spent 3 hours playing chess or out building a dirt fort, we almost give them a trophy. But if it's 3 hours of Minecraft, we're like, that's it.
We need to go see a counselor.
Yeah. Yeah. Getting over our own selves.
The kids were talking on the bus today about like if back in the day, I'm sure there were professors who were like, calculators, what? This society as we know it. Yeah. If you do it all on a calculator, what will you ever do with your brain? What in the world? You can't use those in my classroom, right? Like this pushback of this technology we completely take for granted now. And somebody was like, but technology is going to be in every job you ever do in my future. And I was like,
oh, yeah. And it's
are 100% right.
100%.
Yeah, like we'll chastise somebody for using a calculator now. Like we wouldn't even think of such a thing.
We would think it, we just wouldn't say it.
We wouldn't say it. But I was like, you're right. I can't even think of one that I could come up with that you would not need to, even if you go so far out in art and music, you have to be able to put yourself on social media. You have to be able to run a business website or you will starve. Like you have to. And that is a whole degree in and of itself to technology. Like I was like, you are 100% right.
100%. There is a type of coding. My son, when he was looking for jobs, was like, I really want a job where I can work from home. And there's a type of coding that was like super, super, like people, don't know it very well. And he like learned it to get this particular job. Right. And he was like, and he was a finalist. And then they gave him like a test on this coding thing. And he's like, no, I couldn't do it. Right. Like, it wasn't my thing. And he's like, oh my gosh. But he's like, I wish I spent my homeschooling years like learning this code, because I would have been I had my dream job right now. You know? Hindsight's 20/20 vision, kid. I don't know what to tell you, right? Oh my gosh, tell me what code that is so I could go learn it.
Yeah, really good backup.
It's obsolete now.
Yeah, exactly.
It's automated.
Yeah.
So I've had interactions with parents with concerns, right? A kid might start to get into something, try it out, and then decide, okay, I'm not going to do this. We're going to try something else. And some fears with the parents along the lines of, I don't see them following through with, something that they have in mind. I would, right? So the question is, childhood, is there a biological reason for like the amount of just like getting into everything and trying stuff out and okay, I'm going to quickly shift from that and get into something else? Or even is it common? Do you see that a lot with kids?
That's play.
Yeah.
Right. That's play at its finest. And that's preference and learning preference. And a lot of times we hate it because we invest a lot of money on equipment or lessons or things to support the hobby that we think is going to be this amazing thing, and it isn't. And that's more on us than on them. And that's hard to say as a parent because I've done the same thing. But yeah, that's play, right? Like that's how you learn preference. I like this. I don't prefer this. That's also how you learn to quit well. And giving up is a skill, right? Being able to say this doesn't serve me is a skill. It doesn't mean that the kid's going to have like 12 marriages when they get older, right? I actually think that's our fear. I think our fear is like our kids are going to like just quit jobs and keep quitting jobs, or that they'll keep quitting relationships that don't work and they won't try hard enough. But these are kids, right? They're not 30-year-olds. And so the preference thing is important to me. It's important to know your preferences and to have that practice as a kid and as a teen.
And just to kind of clarify your journey through this, you didn't have points where you consciously thought, man, I really need to talk about this or have a discussion about this. It was pretty organic as he went through things.
No, I mean, we constantly talked about things. Life wasn't like, oh, Gina was the perfect parent and here is my perfect child. I mean, we would constantly have discussions about like, hey, I don't really think like that was a good choice. And why would you make that choice? There was a lot of like, he would say, my mom's parenting philosophy was talks. And it was like the worst thing ever, right? Because I'd be like, what's your reasoning for that? And why did you choose that? And what were you thinking when you chose it? And how did that choice turn out for you? Right? So we talked about everything. And, that helps you grow. So everything was a conversation. A lot of the things were a conversation. That's one thing we do a lot is talk. And still to this day, when either of us is in conflict or having a problem at work, we will get on the phone and we will just talk it out, right? And we both know how to sort of navigate each other's worlds. And that's a really nice thing. It's an interesting thing being a mother of an adult child. It's bittersweet, but it's also a really cool thing. He knows me better than anyone else. I know him better than anyone else. And that's really cool. That's a really, really cool thing.
Did you see a lot of those type of really strong relationships in your interviewees and people you discussed with, or families you?
Yeah. The young adult unschoolers that we interviewed all had really strong relationships with their family. It was one of the benefits of unschooling, really strong relationships with their siblings, right? Because when you're in traditional school, generally you're separated from your siblings. And when you're unschooling, you're in a self-directed learning environment, generally you're with your siblings for a longer amount of time. So we did see from both the parent perspective as well as the young adult perspective that one of the benefits of unschooling was stronger family relationships and stronger extended family relationships, right? Like as much as my parents gave us such beef for unschooling, they are, my son is a very good grandson to his very old grandmother. And that's learned, right? That's from years of nurturing and watching her get older and things like that.
Yeah, that's good to hear that that's a common thing, and that
Yeah.
everyone's normal and has sibling, probably rivalries or issues.
So Tiffany's got 3 boys with us, so that's.
Oh, see, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that comes from research, which I think is the coolest part, right?
Yeah, I really love that you guys have done this research. It's a great grounding tool for a lot of us, but it's also wonderful that you don't just focus on, okay, well, this number did homeschooling, this number didn't. You're really diving into what that experience was like and how similar or dissimilar it was to others. And I really appreciate it. I haven't read enough of it yet, but we're really excited to delve more into it.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's so important to me. It's so important to us. It legitimizes a movement that has never been legitimized. And it will change the world of education. So I'm so excited. I love the research that I do. It's a huge part of my life.
Yeah, and what that'll do for future students.
Yeah, I was thinking about that on the drive over, like as we're getting ready, I'm like totally nerd fangirling out over you because I'm like, oh, Gina Riley is gonna be like almost here. I was like, is this real life?
You can go tell my family over there.
I was totally, I was like, oh, I can't believe it's her. But that's the thing, because Paul and I are like, we took some big steps for a really conservative small town, but it's because like at our core, we knew not just for our kids, but for our other kids that we like, whomever we can get into this community, like it's worth taking really big risks and stepping out into the unknown. But then like people like you and Peter Gray and this Sudbury Valley movement that did so much of the research, like that foundation is there for us to say, no, parents, it's like, I know you're already thinking that it's going to be good, but like, I promise it's going to be good. Like, look at what these people have already found out. We can really rest on that data because it's long-term data and it's good data. And these are really great people who are researching it for us before we even knew we would need to, so like us being able to rely on you and others like you in your field is monumental to what we're trying to do here. So for our tiny little 27 group that's growing to maybe 35 next year, like I don't know that we would be able to sustain if you guys weren't doing what you were doing. So like from the bottom of our hearts, we're so grateful that you guys are pioneering 20 years before we needed you, because we need you now and we needed you then. So really so grateful.
You have not a clue how much that means. It becomes life's work. And so thank you. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. For sure.
Gina, where can we follow your work, or where's a good place to follow what you're doing? Tiffany sent out a lot of links, but if there's
I don't even know anymore. I have a website. I don't even know anymore. So I have a website. I think it's GinaRileyPhD.com. I'm really not sure. I'm on Twitter. It's Professor G. Riley. I'm really active on Facebook. You'll find me. And ResearchGate. ResearchGate is the website of academics. And so that's where you'll find copies of all the research that I've done. That's an important place. And I continue to do research. So it'll be fun to see what's next. Currently, it's a study of unschoolers with disabilities. And so I'm really excited because the data is so amazing.
Ooh, I will be following that. We've been talking about things around here. That's very
Yeah, so good. Such good stuff.
If I could ask you just on that, how do you go about finding unschoolers? I mean, it's, like you said, they were kind of all hiding in their respective caves, if you will, for a long time, to put the word out to actually get to interview them. How do you go about finding them?
Yeah, it's so hard gaining participants. Unschooled participants for studies has been a real struggle. Unschoolers just naturally don't love research, it's assessment, right? It's like how'd you do? And so it's been one of the hardest parts of my research journey has been finding participants. I'm very thankful that right now the movement trusts us so much. So I have a little bit of an easier time. Peter Gray has been wonderful in putting out a call on his blogs. He has been my savior so many times. So yes, it's definitely difficult to find participants. But that seems natural and normal for me because, as an unschooling parent, you're a little suspicious of these people who want to study your kid.
Right. And do you feel like you have more discussions with colleagues in the educational department or your psychology departments about this?
I just came out, right? Like I spent years hiding my research.
not anymore.
Not anymore. At a school of education. And so when my book came out, it came out at a good time during the pandemic when everyone was homeschooling and unschooling. So it wasn't quite a stigma anymore. People were like, whoa, right? Like they had my CV, but they never really cared. And so it's been really cool to have conversations with colleagues. My chair will still say, you do research on intrinsic motivation, and that's fine, right? Like the homeschooling and unschooling is still sort of like a dirty word, but we're getting there. And I'm really proud that I can have conversations with colleagues about homeschoolers and unschoolers and that they're interested. That is huge.
Yeah, very good.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Well,
thank you. Again, we're just blown away that you took the time for us and that you shared so many wonderful stories and not advice, but beautiful stories.
Not advice.
I think we all got a lot out of it and so appreciate your time and just the warmth and energy you can share with us even this far away is really wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thank you for what you're doing. You have no idea how much these schools are so important to us. Thank you. I have loved hanging out with you. I would hang out with you all night. Thank you so much for having me. Truly grateful. Have a